In the village of Omu, high upon the whispering hills, the wind was never still. It sang through the trees, danced with the river, and carried the voices of those who once lived and loved. The villagers said that the wind remembered everything, that it kept the truths people tried to bury. They believed that when someone lied, the wind would howl in protest, and when someone's heart broke, it would hum softly through the night as if to soothe them. It was in this village of endless murmurs that a girl named Ebony lived, her spirit as gentle as morning light. Ebony was 17, with eyes the color of quiet rain and hands that always held paper. She wrote letters, endless letters, to her late mother, to the ancestors who guarded the village, and sometimes to the wind itself. The villagers often found scraps of parchment under stones or tucked inside tree bark, written in her neat, slanted script. They would smile, shake their heads and say, "That girl is speaking to the unseen." But to Ebony her letters were not madness. They were her only way to be heard in a home that no longer listened. Her father, once a man of laughter and music, had grown distant since remarrying a woman named Iriel. Iriel came from another village, and though her beauty caught every eye, it was her charm that won her place beside Ebony's father. In the beginning she played her role well, kind smiles, sweet words, warm food. But when night fell and no one was watching, her voice sharpened like a knife. The neighbors began to whisper. They called her, the woman with two faces. Iriel was not merely cruel, she was envious. She envied the way people spoke softly to Ebony, how elders smiled when she passed, how even the wind seemed to favor her. Ebony's presence reminded Iriel of everything she could never be, pure, loved, and unafraid to dream. And so she set her mind to break that spirit, thread by thread, the way one unravels a tapestry until only dust remains. Ebony's father, meanwhile, began traveling often for trade. Each time he left, Iriel's voice grew louder in the house. "Do not waste ink," she would snap when Ebony sat to write. "Your words cannot bring back the dead." Ebony would bow her head, waiting for Iriel's footsteps to fade before dipping her quill again. Her letters were her secret lifeline. She wrote about the smell of rain, about dreams where her mother braided her hair, about the ache of missing a love she had never known. When Ebony finished, she would walk to the great baobab tree that stood at the edge of the village, a tree so ancient that its roots were said to cradle the bones of ancestors. She would kneel, place her letter at its base and whisper, "Carry this to her." Then she would wait, feeling the wind lift the edges of the paper, as if the air itself were reading. Sometimes she thought she heard a faint voice answering back, a voice that felt like home. The villagers watched her with quiet affection. Some pitied her, others feared the depth of her silence. Yet all agreed that there was something sacred about her bond with words. The wind around her always seemed softer, more alive, as though it listened. Even children chasing kites would pause when Ebony passed, sensing the air shift around her like invisible hands. But Iriel saw none of this beauty. She saw only a challenge. She could not bear that her stepdaughter found peace in something she could not touch or destroy. So she began to test her, small cruelties at first, words disguised as care. She would spill water on Ebony's letters by mistake, hide her quills, or tell her father that the girl wasted time dreaming instead of helping with chores. And though Ebony said nothing, her eyes grew tired, her smile thinner. Each night, when the wind swept across the hills, carrying stories and secrets, it lingered outside their home longer than usual, as if worried. The villagers began to notice strange patterns, how the air turned heavy near Iriel's hut, how even the birds flew wide around it. Some said the ancestors were watching. Others whispered that the wind itself had chosen Ebony. And so the day stretched quietly like strings pulled too tight. Ebony kept writing, Iriel kept watching, and the wind kept whispering, warning, remembering, waiting for the moment when truth would finally rise. Every morning, when the first light touched the village roofs, Ebony rose before anyone else stirred. The air still tasted of dew and silence, and that was when her thoughts flowed most freely. She would sit by the small window of her room, her candle flickering low, and begin to write. Her letters were more than words, they were her heartbeat made visible. She wrote to her late mother, to the spirits who guarded the baobab tree of echoes, to the ancestors who slept beneath its roots. Each word was a breath of longing, each sentence a prayer for strength. "Mother," one letter began, her ink slightly smudged by tears, "I try to be as strong as the tree you loved. I smile when they expect me to, I stay silent when they tell me to, but inside I am breaking like dry bark." She would fold the letter neatly, seal it with a small pressed flower, and hide it in the folds of her dress. Then, when the sun rose high enough to soften the earth, she would walk barefoot to the baobab tree. The villagers called it the Tree of Echoes, for they said that if you spoke your truth beneath it, the wind would carry it to those who needed to hear. Ebony would kneel there and whisper, "Take it to her," placing her letter at the base of the tree. The wind would stir, gentle but deliberate, as though answering her plea. Sometimes she saw the edge of the paper flutter away, rising slowly until it vanished in the sky. When that happened, she smiled through her tears, believing her mother had received her message. But Ebony did not write to her mother alone. There was another who understood her, the only soul who saw her pain not as weakness but as beauty. His name was Ghanian, a young man who lived by the river with his widowed mother. Ghanian was quiet and observant, his laughter soft and his gaze steady. He often met Ebony by the water when she went to fetch her jar. Over time they began to share their stories, their dreams and their wounds. One afternoon, as they sat watching ripples dance on the river's surface, Ebony confessed, "Sometimes I feel like my words will vanish when I do. Like they will sink and be forgotten." Ghanian smiled and dipped his fingers into the current. "Words don't drown," he said. "They float, they fly. Even if no one hears them, the wind does. One day, Ebony, your letters will fly higher than pain itself." His words stayed with her, a small flame she carried inside her chest. That evening, Ebony wrote again, not to her mother this time but to Ghanian. It was a simple letter, one that spoke of gratitude and friendship. She hid it under a flat stone by the river where Ghanian would later find it. It became their quiet ritual. Every few days one would leave a letter for the other, each note filled with warmth, laughter, and the comfort of being understood. But peace in Ariel's house never lasted long. One afternoon, as Ebony prepared to leave for the baobab tree, Ariel appeared at the doorway, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "What do you carry?" she asked. Ebony froze, clutching the folded letter against her chest. "It's nothing, Mama," she whispered. Ariel snatched it before she could protest. Her lips curled as she read. "You waste ink on ghosts?" she spat. "Do you think the dead answer your nonsense?" She tore the letter in half, then into smaller pieces, letting them fall like wounded birds to the floor. Ebony tried to gather the fragments, her voice trembling. "They are just words." "Foolish dreams," Ariel sneered. "You think writing will save you from truth? The dead do not read, girl. The wind cannot heal your emptiness." She walked away, leaving Ebony to kneel among the scraps, her tears mingling with ink. For a few days Ebony stopped writing. Her hands itched for the quill, but fear kept them still. The silence in her chest grew heavy. Then one night, unable to bear it, she lit her candle again and wrote another letter, this one hidden deep within her skirt. The next morning she left for the river early, long before Ariel awoke. Ghanian was waiting. He noticed the redness in her eyes but said nothing. Instead, he handed her a folded page of his own. "Even ashes can whisper," it read. "So let your heart speak even if someone tries to burn its words." For the first time in days Ebony smiled. But Ariel's eyes were everywhere. When she later overheard the women at the market whisper about Ebony meeting a boy by the river, her anger burned like dry wood. That evening she called Ebony before her and spoke coldly. "I hear you spend your days with a boy," she said. "You bring shame to your father's name. I will not have gossip ruin this house." Ebony tried to explain that Ghanian was only a friend, someone who listened, but Ariel's face hardened. "Silence," she hissed. "No decent girl trades letters with a man. From now on you will stay away from him. And if I ever find another of your foolish writings, I will burn them all." Ebony bowed her head, but inside her resolve began to grow roots. Her letters were her voice, her truth. And though Ariel's threats echoed in her ears, she knew one thing with certainty: some words were too alive to be silenced. The dry season had come early that year, and the evenings carried the scent of dust and distant fire. The sky glowed orange at sunset, and the wind moved slower, as if it too were tired of carrying the weight of unspoken things. Ebony had gone to the river that evening, her jar balanced on her head, her heart heavy with the silence that had grown between her and her stepmother. She took comfort in the quiet rhythm of the water, the rippling sound that drowned out Ariel's sharp words. She lingered there longer than usual, whispering her thoughts to the current before heading home, unaware of what waited for her. Inside the house, Ariel stood at the doorway of Ebony's small room, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For days she had watched the girl sneak letters out of the house, whisper to the wind, and return with eyes that glowed softly like someone who knew a secret. It filled Ariel with a kind of rage she could not name. Why did this girl, this child, carry such peace when she, the woman of the house, felt none? Jealousy twisted inside her like a burning cord. She wanted to crush it, to end it. That was when she saw the small wooden box beneath Ebony's bed, the one she always guarded. Ariel bent down and pulled it out. Inside, neatly tied with a faded ribbon, were dozens of folded letters. Some were written on old parchment, some on scraps of cloth, all covered with Ebony's careful handwriting. Ariel stared at them for a long time, her breath shallow. The sight of so much tenderness enraged her further. "Let us see what comfort words bring when they burn," she muttered. She carried the box outside into the courtyard, gathered dry sticks and struck a match. The first flame crackled weakly, then caught, growing hungrier by the second. One by one, Ariel tossed the letters into the fire, watching as each page curled, darkened and turned to ash. The wind stirred, restless, sending smoke spiraling upward like souls fleeing from pain. By the time Ebony reached home, the sun had sunk and the sky was bruised purple. The scent hit her before she even reached the yard: burnt paper, ink and loss. She froze when she saw the glow ahead. Ariel stood by the fire, her shadow long and sharp against the wall. The wooden box lay empty beside her, the last of the letters flickering away into smoke. For a heartbeat, Ebony couldn't breathe. She dropped her water jar, the clay shattering as her voice broke the stillness. "Mama, no," she cried, rushing forward. "Please, those were my mother's words." Ariel didn't flinch. Her eyes glinted like dark glass. "Your mother is gone," she said coldly. "Let her rest. You disgrace her memory with this foolishness." Ebony fell to her knees beside the fire, trying to snatch a half-burned page, but it crumbled at her touch. "They were all I had of her," she sobbed. "Please stop, please." Ariel took another letter and tossed it into the flames. "Then let your mother read smoke," she said, her voice low and cruel. The fire crackled louder, the flames casting an eerie glow on her face. It distorted her beauty, revealing the bitterness beneath. Her mouth twisted into something between triumph and hatred as the last letter turned to ash. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling the embers high into the night. For a moment, the smoke rose in shapes that seemed almost to form words before disappearing into the stars. Ariel stepped back, uneasy, but Ebony's eyes were fixed on the sky. Her tears glimmered in the firelight, reflecting the rising smoke. When the fire finally died, Ebony sat in silence, the earth blackened before her. Ariel turned and walked back into the house without a word. But the wind did not leave. It circled around Ebony, tugging gently at her hair, whispering through the ashes as if gathering what was lost. Ebony closed her eyes. Something inside her shifted, something that could not burn. That night, she lay awake, listening to the restless wind outside her window. It carried a sound she had never heard before, soft murmurs, like distant voices calling her name. The grief in her chest did not fade, but it began to take shape, hard and steady. The fire had stolen her past, but it had also lit something new within her, a small, defiant spark that refused to die. The morning after the burning, the village awoke to a strange stillness. The air felt heavy, and the sky wore a faint silver haze, as though the night had not yet released its breath. People stepped out of their huts and looked upward. The wind, usually playful and loud, now moved with purpose, soft, deliberate, almost reverent. Then came the whispers. At first it sounded like rustling leaves, but the words became clear. The old women fetching water froze when they heard their names floating on the breeze. Children pointed at the clouds, where faint shapes, pale as smoke, curved and twisted like handwriting. "Look," a man murmured, shading his eyes. "The sky is writing." Above the hills, the clouds had gathered in thin, glowing lines that formed words no one had written. They drifted slowly, shimmering like ghosts of letters. Some said they recognized prayers Ebony used to recite beneath the baobab tree. Others swore they heard her voice in the wind, soft but certain, reciting verses she had written for her late mother. The villagers stood in awe, whispering blessings and crossing themselves. By the time the sun reached its height, the story had spread through Omu. The ashes from Ariel's fire, people said, had carried Ebony's words to the heavens, and the sky itself had decided to keep them alive. Inside the house, Ariel paced restlessly. The fire from the night before had long gone cold, but the smell of burnt paper still clung to the air. When she stepped outside, she noticed the villagers gathered near her courtyard, all staring upward. She followed their gaze and froze. Across the sky, in faint white strokes, words shimmered like smoke trails. "Mother, hear me. I am still here." Ariel's heart thudded painfully. "No," she whispered. "No, this cannot be." She turned back toward the house, her hands trembling. She knew what the villagers were already thinking: witchcraft, spirits, curses. Panic gripped her. She slammed the door shut, breathing hard. But even inside she could not escape it. The wind slipped through the cracks, carrying echoes of Ebony's old poems. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering the words she had tried to destroy. Ebony, meanwhile, sat by the river, knees drawn to her chest. She had not spoken since the fire. Ghanian found her there, her eyes red from weeping, her fingers covered in ash. He crouched beside her quietly. "They're talking about you," he said softly. "The sky, Ebony, it's writing." She looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" He pointed to the horizon. "Your letters. The ones she burned. They're not gone. The smoke carried them, and now the wind is writing them back." Ebony followed his gaze, and when she saw the faint markings above the hills, her words, her handwriting etched across the sky, her breath caught. The river behind her shimmered as if reflecting the same message. "It's my mother," she whispered. "She's answering me." Ghanian shook his head, smiling in awe. "No, Ebony. The sky itself is defending your truth. You gave your heart to words. Fire cannot kill that." For the first time since the burning, Ebony's lips curved into a small smile. The ache in her chest softened. She dipped her hands into the water and let it run through her fingers. The air around her pulsed gently, humming like a living thing. That night, as she sat in her small room, she lit a candle to pray. When she whispered her mother's name, the flame flickered, then steadied again as though nodding in response. From that night onward, strange things continued to happen. The wind no longer howled randomly, it moved in patterns, echoing sounds like spoken verses. Sometimes, when Ebony spoke softly, the air shimmered around her. Candles would lean toward her voice, and ashes from old fires would rise and scatter into faint symbols. The villagers began to call it the smoke that spoke. They said it was proof that words born from truth could never be silenced. Ariel could not bear it. Each whisper of Ebony's name from the villagers deepened her dread. She avoided the market, for every time she went, she saw people murmuring to the sky, tracing the shapes of letters with their fingers. She would return home and shut every window, but the wind found her all the same, brushing against her ears with voices that seemed to mock her. Once, she woke in the night to find ashes scattered on her floor, forming the faint outline of Ebony's name. The next morning she confronted Ebony, her tone sharp and trembling. "You will stop this," she hissed. "No more writing, no more nonsense. You bring shame and fear to this house." Ebony looked up calmly, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and strength. "I didn't ask the sky to speak," she said. "But I will not stop it from telling the truth." Ariel raised her hand but stopped midair. For a fleeting second, the candle flame between them grew tall and bright, its light dancing against her palm as though warning her. She lowered her hand slowly, her face pale. From that day, Ariel forbade Ebony from keeping ink or paper in the house. She locked away the quills and tore the leftover pages. But Ebony's spirit had already learned freedom. If she could not write on paper, she would write elsewhere. She began carving her words into small river stones, smooth and round, pressing each letter carefully with a piece of sharp wood. She hid them beneath the water near the reeds, where the current could read them. Sometimes she used bark from fallen trees, scratching lines of poetry across their surface and tucking them under roots or inside hollows. And always the wind would find them. As weeks passed, people began discovering her hidden messages, tiny carvings with words of courage, hope, and remembrance. Mothers tied them to their children's wrists for protection. Travelers carried them as charms. The legend of Ebony's smoke spread far beyond Omu. They said she was the girl whose letters reached heaven, whose words had taught the sky to listen. And on nights when the moon shone through a veil of cloud, villagers claimed they could still see her handwriting drifting faintly above, glowing like silver mist, proof that no fire, no cruelty, and no silence could ever burn away truth. Beneath the pale moonlight, the river whispered secrets to the restless wind. Ebony, barefoot and trembling, walked along its soft bank, her heart heavy with exile and memory. She had left behind the walls that once held her dreams, the house where her mother's laughter had faded into echoes, and where her stepmother's fire had devoured every word she ever loved. Now silence clung to her like a shadow. But even in that silence, her spirit refused to die. Ariel had gone too far. After the smoke in the courtyard, after the cruel words that cut deeper than any blade, she sought to extinguish not only Ebony's letters but her very voice. One morning she walked to the home of the diviner, a frail man with gray beads around his neck and eyes that looked beyond the world. Ariel demanded that he silence the girl who spoke too much to spirits. But the diviner did not bow to her arrogance. He stared into the bowl of cowrie shells, the reflection of the sky rippling on the surface, and murmured, "The girl is not yours to silence. She is marked by the wind mother. If you burn her words again, the wind will remember your name." Ariel's pride hardened. "Then let the wind come," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I will not have her shame this family with her madness." The diviner only sighed. Pride blinds the heart before the storm. But Ariel did not listen. When she returned home, she found every trace of ink and paper and gathered them into a clay pot. One by one she tossed them into the hearth, the smell of burnt ink mixing with the bitter smoke of palm oil. She ordered the servants to throw away every reed pen, every scrap of bark, every thread of parchment. Then she turned to Ebony, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. "You will speak no more of letters, no more of spirits. Your words bring misfortune." Ebony's father returned that evening, weary from weeks of trading journeys. He noticed his daughter's swollen eyes, her trembling hands, but before he could speak, Ariel filled his ears with venom. "Your daughter talks to ghosts. She writes words that summon storms. Even the diviner fears her." The father hesitated. He loved his daughter once, but years of Ariel's whispers had weakened his trust. "Ebony," he said softly, "why must you bring fear into this house?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I only write to remember her," she pleaded, "to keep mother alive in the wind." But he turned away, his shoulders sinking under the weight of doubt. "Enough," he said. "Let peace return to this home." And with those words, something inside Ebony broke. She packed her small bundle of belongings, a worn wrapper, a carved wooden comb, and the stone pendant her mother had left her, and walked away from the house without looking back. The wind followed her steps, swirling dust around her feet like a silent escort. When she reached the riverbank, Ghanian found her there, sitting on a rock, staring at the ripples that carried the reflection of the moon. "You should not be here alone," he said gently, his eyes full of worry. "Your father will look for you." She shook her head. "He believes I am cursed. Let the wind find me if he will not." Ghanian sat beside her in silence for a while, then smiled faintly. "If your hands cannot write, your tongue still can. Speak your letters, Ebony. The wind will carry them higher than paper ever could." At first, Ebony thought it foolish. But as the night deepened, the river breeze brushed her face like a friend's hand. She closed her eyes and began to whisper. Her words rose and danced with the current of air, soft, trembling, beautiful. "Mother," she said, "they burned what I wrote but not what I feel. They silenced my pen but not my soul." The wind stirred, lifting the strands of her hair and scattering her voice like petals into the sky. It felt as though the world itself was listening. From that night onward, Ebony spoke to the wind. Each evening she would stand by the baobab of echoes, her face turned to the open sky, and speak the letters she once wrote. Her voice wove through the trees, across the hills, through the sleeping huts of the village. People began to wake at night, hearing faint whispers carried by the breeze, verses of love, sorrow, and hope. They said the wind now spoke like a girl mourning her mother. The children would shiver and whisper, "It is Ebony's spirit talking to the sky." But Ebony was alive, more alive than ever. Each spoken letter made her lighter, stronger. The river hummed her words, the leaves trembled when she spoke of grief, and even the crickets seemed to pause when she prayed. Ghanian would often sit nearby, listening, his heart heavy with awe. "You see," he said once, "the fire destroyed your letters, but now your words belong to the air. No one can burn the wind." Meanwhile, Ariel's nights grew restless. The same wind that carried Ebony's voice would slip through her windows, whispering fragments of sentences she thought had turned to ash. Sometimes she would wake to hear her own name spoken softly, Ariel, as if the smoke of her cruelty had learned to talk back. The servants began to murmur that the wind was haunted. Ariel tried to drown the whispers with chants, but the more she fought, the louder they became. Ebony did not know that her voice was haunting her stepmother. She only knew that she could breathe again. She began to find peace by the river, her laughter returning in fragile waves. She and Ghanian built a small hut from palm leaves, where she kept stones and pieces of bark on which she carved symbols, tiny marks that meant hope, freedom, memory. She no longer needed ink to write. Her words were carved into the breath of the world. When the wind blew strongest, she lifted her arms and let it take her voice. And somewhere above the hills, the smoke that once carried her pain became the sky's own story, a story of a girl whose silence was not defeat but transformation. The season of rain came early that year, and with it something no one could explain. The fields near the river grew lush with green, maize rose taller than any elder could remember, and the cassava roots swelled like gifts from the earth itself. Mothers swore their infants slept better when the wind blew from the east, and fathers said their cattle no longer strayed from the pastures. But those who listened closely knew why. The wind carried a voice, gentle yet powerful, whispering words that healed the heart and calmed the land. It was Ebony's voice. At night, she still stood by the baobab tree of echoes, her silhouette silvered by moonlight. Her soft songs floated into the sky, songs of remembrance, forgiveness, and love. The villagers began to speak of her not as a cursed child but as the wind's daughter. They said that her mother's spirit had woven her soul into the breeze, and that even the ancestors turned their faces when she spoke. When Ebony sang near the fields, the air shimmered as though listening. Birds settled quietly on branches, and even the insects seemed to hum in harmony. It was as if nature itself bowed to her truth. But peace is a flame that envy always tries to smother. Uriel watched from afar, her heart blackened with fear and bitterness. Each blessing that touched the village felt to her like an insult, a reminder that what she tried to destroy had only grown stronger. She has bewitched them, Uriel hissed to anyone who would listen. She brings strange winds and voices that mock the living. She spread rumors like poison, whispering to the market women that Ebony's words came from restless spirits, that the wind carried curses wrapped in song. At first, people dismissed Uriel's talk, for they had seen with their own eyes how Ebony's presence brought good fortune. But as days passed, doubt crept into their hearts like fog. What if the blessings are a trap? Some murmured. What if she is calling spirits who will one day turn against us? Fear began to stir where once there had been awe. When a sudden storm struck the village one afternoon, tearing a roof from a hut and scattering baskets through the fields, Uriel seized her chance. She ran through the streets, her hair wild, her voice shrill. "Do you see?" she cried. "The girl has angered the ancestors. The wind obeys her tongue. Bring her before the chief before she destroys us all." The frightened villagers, desperate for peace, gathered near the chief's compound demanding answers. The chief, a wise man with lines of time across his face, listened silently. He had heard Ebony's voice before, carried through the night air like a prayer. But he also knew the fear of his people could not be ignored. "Bring her here," he said softly. "Let us see whose breath the wind truly follows." That evening, messengers found Ebony by the river, where she was teaching children to hum her wind songs. She did not resist when they told her the chief summoned her. "If truth must be questioned," she said quietly, "then let the wind answer with me." Ghanian tried to stop her, but she only smiled. "You once said words have wings. Perhaps tonight they will show theirs." The entire village gathered in the open courtyard. Torches flickered, their flames bending with the restless air. Ebony stood barefoot in the center, her white wrapper fluttering like the wings of a bird. Uriel stood among the onlookers, her eyes glittering with victory. The chief leaned forward. "Ebony, daughter of Olumo, they say you speak with spirits and command the wind. Tell us, are you blessed or are you cursed?" Ebony looked down, her voice soft but steady. "I am only a girl who loved her mother," she said. "Fire ate my letters but fire cannot eat truth. Smoke carries what the wind remembers." Her words drifted into silence. Then she raised her head and added, "Fire may eat paper but smoke feeds the sky." A hush fell. Even the flames of the torches trembled. Then suddenly the wind rose. It was not violent, it was alive. The villagers gasped as dust lifted gently from the ground and spiraled upward, glowing faintly in the moonlight. From the swirling air, faint shapes began to form, letters shimmering like threads of silver smoke. They spelled out her words, hanging in the sky for all to see. "Fire may eat paper but smoke feeds the sky." The people fell to their knees, murmuring prayers, covering their faces in awe. The chief stood, his voice trembling. "This is no curse," he whispered. "This is the voice of truth itself." The wind swept through the courtyard again, brushing against each person like a tender hand. The flames steadied, the torches burned brighter, and even the clouds parted to reveal a full moon shining overhead. Uriel stumbled backward, her mouth open in disbelief. Her lies, her envy, all seemed to dissolve into the air that now carried Ebony's power. The villagers began to chant softly, praising the Wind Mother, thanking the ancestors and blessing Ebony. The chief approached her, bowing his head slightly. "Your words have fed the sky," he said. "And now the sky feeds our souls." As Ebony looked up, she saw the silver smoke letters fade slowly into the heavens, as though her mother's spirit was reading them once more. And for the first time since her letters had burned, she smiled, not with sadness but with peace. The wind that had once carried her grief now carried her truth, written not on paper but across the endless sky. The morning air carried tension thicker than any fog the village had ever seen. News of the chief's summons had spread quickly, and soon the courtyard was packed with villagers, their eyes wide with anticipation and fear. Mothers clutched their children close, elders leaned heavily on carved staffs, and even the market women whispered prayers under their breath. Iriel stood among them, her hands twisting the edges of her headscarf, her heart pounding with fury and dread. Every glance at Ebony fueled her jealousy, yet she could not move or speak without drawing the gaze of the chief and the wind itself. The chief, seated beneath the carved arch of the village altar, raised his hands for silence. His eyes, calm and deliberate, swept over the crowd. "The people demand proof," he said. "They seek to know if this girl brings blessings through truth or harm through witchcraft. Iriel, speak your claims." "She is possessed," Iriel cried, her voice sharp and trembling. "Her words summon spirits. The wind obeys her tongue. If she is not punished, this village will be cursed. I ask the council to banish her." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Fear rippled like water. Some glared at Ebony, unsure of what to believe. Others remembered the lush fields, the peaceful children, the thriving crops. They were torn between awe and suspicion. The chief nodded gravely. "The law of our ancestors provides a test. A fire must be lit at the altar. If the smoke rises straight into the sky, the intent is dark and guilt is confirmed. If it scatters, carried by the wind, innocence is proven. Ebony, do you accept this trial?" Ebony bowed her head briefly, her eyes steady. "I do," she said softly. "I only ask that my words reach the sky." She knelt before the altar, her hands brushing over the dry kindling arranged carefully by the priests. The crowd fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. She struck a small flint, and the fire caught quickly, the flames licking at the wood like eager fingers. As the smoke began to rise, Ebony closed her eyes. She whispered almost inaudibly a letter to her mother. "Mother, I am afraid, but I am still yours. Guide this wind and let them see my truth." Her words floated into the smoke, and the flames seemed to lean toward her, pulling the syllables upward like invisible threads. The villagers gasped. The smoke twisted and twirled, bending in arcs and spirals, forming shapes and letters. And then, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to speak, the words became clear. "The truth cannot be buried in ash." The letters shimmered silver against the morning sky, glinting in the sunlight, carried higher and higher by the wind. A sudden gust swept through the courtyard. Iriel's headscarf, twisted in her hands as she tried to assert control, lifted and spun in the wind. The villagers watched in shock as it caught a stray spark from the altar fire. The scarf flared, black smoke curling skyward, and Iriel's face twisted in panic. She dropped it, stepping back as the flames consumed the fabric, leaving nothing but ashes at her feet. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The wind, the fire, and the ashes marked the downfall of deceit. The villagers knelt instinctively, eyes wide and mouths silent. They saw in the smoke Ebony's courage, her connection to the ancestors, and her purity. The wind carried her words as surely as the sky bore witness, leaving no doubt that the stepmother's lies had no weight here. Mothers clutched their children tighter, whispering thanks to the Wind Mother, and elders bowed their heads, murmuring prayers of acknowledgement for the girl who had survived cruelty with only her spirit and her words. Iriel staggered back, her face pale, and for the first time she saw the truth of her actions reflected in the eyes of the villagers. Their fear of Ebony had been replaced by reverence, their doubt transformed into certainty. She realized that every act of cruelty she had committed had only strengthened the girl she sought to break. The chief leaned forward, his gaze steady on Iriel before settling on Ebony. "The trial is complete," he declared. "The smoke carries the truth and the wind answers for her. The girl is innocent. Let this day remind us all that truth and virtue cannot be buried in fire or fear." Ebony lowered her gaze briefly, then looked up at the villagers, the silver smoke still lingering above like a banner of victory. She saw the awe in their eyes, the shift of hearts that had once doubted her. Ghanian stood quietly by the river's edge, his eyes full of pride. The wind brushed through Ebony's hair, gentle and approving, carrying the last whispers of her letter to her mother, who surely read them from somewhere beyond. Iriel stumbled from the courtyard, humiliated and powerless. The village no longer feared her, and her schemes had been laid bare by the very wind she could not command. As the villagers returned to their homes, murmuring of blessings and truth, the message in the sky lingered, a testament that no fire, no falsehood, and no cruelty could ever consume what is born from love and courage. And Ebony, standing by the altar, felt her heart lift. The wind swirled around her once more, brushing her face, lifting her skirts, carrying her whispered words across the hills. She knew the truth she had spoken, the truth in her letters, in her songs, in her very soul, would always travel farther than any fire, reaching ears that needed to hear and skies that refused to forget. Iriel stumbled through the village streets, her heart hammering, her breath ragged. The smoke from Abony's trial still lingered in the air, curling around the torches and the scattered ashes. But now it moved differently, thicker, purposeful, almost alive. It seemed to follow her, swirling in silver-gray ribbons that twisted like fingers reaching out, carrying whispers of every word she had tried to destroy. Each curl reminded her of her lies, her cruelty, her failures. The villagers parted silently as she passed, their eyes full of pity and fear, and she could not bear to meet a single gaze. By midday, Iriel had reached the edge of the forest. Her head spun from shame, and her tongue could not form the words to defend herself. She fell to her knees in the soft moss, the smoke drifting closer, wrapping around her like a judgment she could not escape. The forest seemed to respond to her despair, leaves trembling and branches bending toward her as though the earth itself knew her guilt. Villagers later whispered that she had wandered like that for days, mumbling to herself, the ashes of Abony's burned letters swirling endlessly around her, rising with every gust of wind as if mocking the stepmother's downfall. Some claimed they saw her shadow blending with the smoke, a figure lost between regret and fear, never to find peace. Meanwhile, back in the village, Abony's father paced his home, wringing his hands. The trial, the wind's witness, the silver smoke letters, they had all opened his eyes to the truth. He realized the cruelty his wife had sown, and the injustice he had allowed to fester. With tears in his eyes, he approached Abony, who sat quietly by the river, the wind teasing the edges of her wrapper. "My daughter," he said, voice shaking, "I was blind. Forgive me for doubting you, for listening to lies instead of truth." Abony looked at him calmly. Her gaze was steady, filled with the strength she had nurtured through fire, smoke, and exile. "Father," she said gently, "I forgive you, but I cannot return to the house. My home is no longer bricks and walls, it is the wind and the river and the words that carry me." She paused, letting the wind lift a strand of her hair. "The wind has already made me its home." Touched by her words, he bowed his head and stepped back, knowing that no plea could pull her from the life she had forged. Ghanian stood nearby, smiling quietly, offering the reassurance of friendship and loyalty that had never wavered. The villagers, inspired by Abony's courage and the undeniable power of her words, decided to honor her truth. They built a small hut beside the great baobab tree of echoes, the very tree where she had first entrusted her letters to the wind. Its walls were simple, made of clay and thatch, but its placement was sacred, a witness to resilience, to survival, and to the power of voice. Children gathered around her daily, their faces eager and curious. Abony taught them to write letters and carve words into bark, to speak their truths fearlessly, and to respect the wind as a messenger of justice and memory. She told them of her mother, of the letters burned and carried into the sky, and of the fire that could never consume courage. The baobab's leaves rustled in approval, the wind swirling around the children, lifting their words and laughter as if blessing them with the same invisible protection that had guided Abony all these years. Iriel's name faded from the village as stories of her downfall spread, replaced by tales of the girl whose letters defied fire, whose voice tamed the wind, and whose spirit remained unbroken. And every evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, the villagers could hear faint whispers floating from Abony's hut, lessons, poems, and stories carried on the breeze, a living proof that truth, once spoken or written, could never be destroyed. In this way, Abony found her home, not in stone or timber, but in the wind itself, teaching those who came after her that words, courage, and love endure beyond cruelty, beyond fire, and beyond fear. Years passed, and the hills of Omu grew familiar with the gentle rhythm of Abony's presence. The girl who had once knelt by the river, whispering letters into the wind, had become a woman of quiet strength and boundless wisdom. Villagers spoke her name with reverence. Abony, the woman who taught the wind to speak. Her legend traveled beyond the hills, carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering storytellers. From distant villages, people came seeking her guidance, listening as her voice wove through the trees and across the fields, as if the wind itself had become her instrument. Each morning she would rise with the sun, greeting Ghanian with a soft smile. They had grown together, their bond shaped by shared hardships, laughter, and the countless hours spent teaching the wind to carry their words. Ghanian never failed to marvel at her courage. "You have given more than letters, more than poems," he would say. "You've given the world a way to hear what it often refuses to listen to." Ebony would laugh softly, brushing his hand with her own. "The wind was never mine to teach," she replied. "It only learned from the truth it already carried." Children adored her, running through the baobab grove to hear stories of bravery, sorrow, and resilience. She taught them to carve their words into bark, to trace letters in sand, to whisper poems into the breeze. She encouraged them to speak their truths, reminding them that even when voices are silenced, the spirit finds a way to speak. Elders would smile, watching as their grandchildren carried messages through the village, seeing Ebony's legacy grow like the crops that once flourished under her songs. Ghanian and Ebony's love, steady and enduring, became a quiet legend of its own. Together they navigated the rhythms of life, celebrating the wind's whispers, tending to the fields and comforting those who had lost hope. They would sit by the river in the evenings, listening to the murmurs of water and wind, each story of grief or joy carried safely into the sky. Even in old age, Ebony's voice remained clear, unwavering, a living testament that words, once given to the wind, never die. On her final day, Ebony awoke with the sun spilling gold across the baobab grove. She gathered a sheet of parchment and dipped her pen into ink that shimmered like twilight. Carefully she wrote one last letter, to the ones who will one day lose their voice. Know that even when silence seems eternal, your truth can travel farther than fire or fear. Speak, write, and trust the wind. Her hand trembled only slightly, and when she finished, she folded the letter neatly, placing it in the center of the grove. Without hesitation, she lit a small fire beneath it. The flames consumed the paper quickly, curling and blackening the edges. Ebony watched, serene, as the smoke spiraled upward, twisting into shapes reminiscent of her mother's letters, of her own youth, and of every word she had ever shared with the wind. The villagers, gathered quietly at a respectful distance, felt the sacredness of the moment, the culmination of a life lived in harmony with truth, courage, and the unseen forces of the world. That night, as the last embers died, a gentle rain began to fall. It was soft, steady, and fragrant with the faint scent of ink and firewood, as if the wind and the heavens themselves were honoring her life. Children ran to feel the droplets on their faces, elders bowed their heads in gratitude, and even Ghanian stayed silent, letting the moment wash over him. Every raindrop seemed to carry a whisper, a fragment of the stories, letters, and truths Ebony had shared. Though Ebony's voice would no longer rise through the village, the wind had learned to speak on its own. Travelers carried her words far beyond Omu, and the baobab grove remained alive with laughter, whispers, and carved letters. Her teachings endured, shaping hearts and minds, reminding every listener that words like the wind cannot be chained. And so, the woman who had once been silenced by fire became eternal through the sky, the river, and the wind. Even in her absence, her truths floated across the hills, mingling with the rain, and touching all those who would one day lose their voice, teaching them, as she had taught the world, that courage, love, and truth are never truly lost. They only travel farther than we ever imagined. Long after Ebony's footsteps had faded from the riverbank and the baobab grove, her story remained alive in the village of Omu. Children would play under the shade of the great tree, their laughter mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves, and often they would pause mid-game to look skyward. Above them, the clouds twisted and turned in strange patterns, shapes that seemed too deliberate to be merely wind-blown vapors. Some looked like letters curling in the air, others like whole sentences written in silver smoke, drifting lazily across the blue. Elders, sitting nearby on worn wooden benches, would smile knowingly. When the children asked what they were seeing, they would begin the story. "Many years ago there was a girl named Ebony," they would say, their voices soft with reverence. "She loved words more than anything, and she wrote letters to her mother, to the ancestors, and even to the wind itself. One day her stepmother burned them, hoping to erase her truth. But the fire could not destroy what was meant to live in the air. The smoke carried her words upward, and the wind remembered them forever." The children's eyes would widen, imagining the smoke rising, twisting into letters visible only to those who believed in courage, in love, and in truth. Some of the braver ones would lean closer, asking if they could hear Ebony's voice in the breeze. The elders would chuckle, nodding toward the trees and the river, saying, "The wind carries more than air. Listen closely, and you may hear her letters singing to the sky, reminding us all that truth cannot be silenced." Ebony's legend grew with each retelling, passed from parent to child and from village to village. Travelers carried it to distant lands, and soon her story became more than a tale, it became a proverb. Words written in truth may burn, but their smoke feeds the sky forever. It was a saying that mothers whispered to their children, a reminder that even when hands try to destroy what is honest, courage and love cannot be erased. Seasons turned, rivers swelled and shrank, and new generations grew under the watchful sky that still remembered. Farmers spoke to the breeze when planting crops, believing it carried Abony's blessings. Teachers encouraged students to write their hearts, telling them, even if no one reads your words, the wind does. Storytellers wove her legend into songs and poems, and during festivals children would reenact her courage, burning mock letters and watching as imaginary smoke swirled into the clouds. And sometimes when the wind picked up unexpectedly, the villagers would pause. They would hear the faintest whisper among the rustling leaves or feel a gentle brush on their cheek, carrying the scent of ink and firewood, just as it had on the night Abony's final letter rose to the heavens. They would close their eyes, letting the wind speak to them, imagining that the girl who had once been silenced was sending them a message, a reminder that no force, fire, fear, or cruelty can truly erase a soul that refuses to be quiet. Even the clouds seemed to honor her memory. On certain mornings, wisps of vapor formed shapes that resembled letters, spiraling and dancing across the sky as if writing messages only the observant could read. Villagers claimed that if you watched long enough, you could see fragments of Abony's letters, echoes of her prayers, poems, and dreams, floating forever above the hills, feeding the sky with stories of courage and resilience. And so the tale ends not with silence, but with the eternal murmur of wind and sky. As the narrator would say to any listener willing to believe, the next time the wind passes your ear, listen closely, perhaps it carries the letter of a soul who refused to be silenced. Through generations, Abony's truth remained unbroken, etched not on paper but in the clouds, in the wind, and in the hearts of those who dare to speak, write, and remember. Her letters may have burned, but their smoke feeds the sky forever, a living testament to the power of words, courage, and the indomitable spirit of one girl who refused to be silenced.